My name is Mary, and at 65, I truly believe there was nothing left in life that could surprise me. I was wrong. That morning started like any other. I was in my small backyard, trimming the lavender bushes I had planted years ago with my late husband. The air was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind that reminds you how alone you've become without noticing when it happened. Then my phone rang. It was my son. I remember wiping my hands on my apron before answering, as if he could somehow see me through the screen. Old habits never leave. When you've spent your whole life being a mother, you don't just stop. "Hi, Mom," he said. Something in his voice felt off.
Tight.
Careful. Still, my heart lifted. He hadn't called in days. Maybe weeks. Time had started blending together lately. "Sweetheart," I smiled into the phone. "This is a nice surprise." There was a pause. A long one. "We need to talk about the trip." Trip. That word alone filled me with warmth. For months, I had been hoping, quietly, without saying it out loud, that maybe I'd be included this time. That maybe I'd get to spend time with him again and with my grandkids, whom I barely saw anymore. "Oh, that sounds wonderful," I said quickly. "Where are we going?" Another pause. This one felt heavier. "Well, that's the thing," he said. "We've been planning this vacation for a while. It's kind of just for us." I didn't speak. "It's more of a couple's trip," he added. "We really need some time alone." I tightened my grip on the phone, staring at the ground as if it could steady me. "I see," I said quietly. But he wasn't finished. "And the kids won't be coming either. They're staying with her parents." So not only was I not invited, there wasn't even space for me in the excuse. I swallowed. "That makes sense," I said, even though it didn't. "You deserve your time together." I meant it. I always meant it. That was the problem. Then I heard her voice in the background. Sharp, controlled, decisive. A second later, the phone shifted. "Mary, hi," she said, her tone suddenly sweet, too sweet. "I'm so glad we're finally talking." That sweetness always made my chest tighten. It was never real. "We were actually thinking," she continued, "that this might be a good moment for you to consider a different living arrangement." I froze. "A different what?" "You know," she said lightly, "somewhere with more support. Somewhere you'd have people around you, activities, structure." My stomach dropped. "You mean the nursing home?" She laughed. Not kindly. "Oh no, not like that," she said. "Think of it more like a place where you can relax. Almost like a resort. A resort. For people whose families no longer wanted them." I sat down slowly on the garden chair because suddenly my legs didn't feel reliable anymore. "You could enjoy your own little vacation," she added, "while we're away." There it was.
Clean.
Simple. Cruel. I glanced around my yard. The flowers, the worn fence, the quiet house behind me. This wasn't just a place. This was my life. Every corner of it built from years of work, sacrifice, love. And now, it was being reduced to an inconvenience. "I understand," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. In the background, I heard my son say something low, uncertain, but she cut him off before I could make it out. "He agrees it might be best," she added quickly. Silence followed. And that silence told me everything. He wasn't going to defend me. Not this time. Maybe not ever. Something inside me shifted right then. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly breaking. "Well," I said, standing up slowly, "I hope you both have a lovely trip." And before either of them could say anything else, I ended the call. I stayed in the garden for a long time after that. Not crying. Not yet. Just sitting there, staring at the flowers like they might explain how everything had changed without me noticing. When did I become optional? When did I become someone who could be placed somewhere convenient? Eventually, I went inside. The house felt different. Quieter than usual. Colder. I walked past the hallway filled with old photos. My son as a child, birthday parties, school events, holidays. Moments I had built my entire life around. Moments I had sacrificed everything for. I stopped in front of one picture in particular. He was about 7 years old, missing his front tooth, grinning at the camera like the world belonged to him. Back then, I was his whole world. Now, I wasn't even part of his plans. I sat on the edge of my bed and finally let the tears come. Not loud sobs, just silent ones. The kind that feel heavier because no one hears them. They wanted me gone, not just from the trip, from their lives. That realization should have destroyed me. Maybe it would have years ago, but something unexpected happened instead. As the tears slowed, something else began to surface. A memory, a feeling, a version of myself I hadn't thought about in a very long time. Before I was just mom. Before I became someone who lived for other people's needs. There had been another version of me. Stronger, smarter, more dangerous than they could ever imagine. I wiped my face slowly and looked around the room again. But this time, I didn't feel small. I felt something else. Something I hadn't felt in years. Clarity. They thought I was weak. They thought I had nowhere to go. They thought I would accept whatever place they assigned me. They were wrong. Very wrong. I stood up, walked across the room, and opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside, beneath old papers and forgotten documents, was a key. And the moment I held it in my hand, I smiled, because suddenly, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. Instead, I sat in the dim light of my living room, turning that small metalichesky key over in my fingers, feeling the weight of something much bigger than metal. It wasn't just a key, it was a door back to a life I had buried so deeply that even I had started to believe it no longer existed. But it did. And now, after that phone call, after being so easily dismissed like an old piece of furniture, I realized something important. I had allowed myself to become invisible. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. Around midnight, I stood up and walked into the spare room. It had become more of a storage space over the years. Boxes, old albums, things I never had the heart to throw away. In the far corner, behind a stack of dusty containers, was a small safe built into the wall. I hadn't opened it in years. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at it, almost afraid of what it represented. Then I knelt down, inserted the key, and turned it. The soft click echoed louder than it should have. Inside were documents. Old, slightly yellowed, but carefully preserved. I pulled them out slowly, placing them on the floor in front of me like pieces of a forgotten identity. At the very top was a folder with a name I hadn't said out loud in decades. A company. My company. The one I built before I gave everything up. The one no one, not even my own son, knew the truth about. Back then, I wasn't just someone's wife. I wasn't just someone's mother. I was Mary, the woman who could walk into a room full of men twice her age and still come out with a final word. I had started small, working from home, organizing trips for neighbors and acquaintances. But I had something most people didn't: vision. I saw opportunities where others saw risk. I knew how to connect people, how to build trust, how to turn something ordinary into something unforgettable. Within a few years, that small idea turned into a real business, then into something bigger. Offices, employees, partnerships. I built relationships with airlines, hotels, investors. I learned how the system worked and, more importantly, how to make it work for me. I wasn't lucky. I was relentless. And then came the biggest risk of my life. There was a struggling airline back then, small, overlooked, barely surviving. Most people saw it as a failing venture. I saw potential. I studied their numbers, their routes, their customer feedback. They didn't need saving, they needed direction. I convinced my husband to trust me, even when it meant risking everything we had. We invested. Not safely, not cautiously, boldly.
And it worked.
What started as a gamble turned into something extraordinary. The company grew, expanded, rebranded. Routes multiplied, profits soared, and suddenly we weren't just participants. We were founders, decision makers, people whose voices mattered. I still remember the first board meeting I attended. I was the youngest person in the room, the only woman. They barely looked at me when I walked in, assumed I was there to assist, to observe, to stay quiet. I didn't stay quiet. By the end of that meeting, they weren't ignoring me anymore. But success always comes with a cost. I started traveling more. Late nights turned into weeks away from home. Meetings, negotiations, expansion plans. I told myself it was temporary, that I was building something for my family, for our future. But time doesn't wait for good intentions. My son was growing up, and I was missing it. The moment everything changed is still burned into my memory. He was 13, standing on a stage at school, performing in a play he had practiced for weeks. He had begged me to come. I promised I would. I truly believed I would. But I didn't. I was in another city, closing a deal that would change the company forever. At the time, it felt important.
Urgent.
Necessary. Until I got the call. He had frozen on stage. Forgotten everything. Just stood there, looking out into the crowd, searching for me. And I wasn't there. When I got home, he didn't yell. He didn't cry in front of me. That somehow made it worse. He just looked at me and said, "You said you'd come." That was the moment I broke. Not as a businesswoman, but as a mother. That same week, I made a decision that shocked everyone around me. I stepped away. I sold my shares, walked out of boardrooms, contracts, meetings, everything I had spent years building. People thought I was making a mistake. Maybe I was. But at the time, it didn't matter. I chose my son, or, at least, I thought I did. What no one knew, what I never told anyone, was that I didn't walk away completely. I kept a small piece. Just a fraction. A quiet safety net hidden under a different name. At the time, it felt insignificant. Just something practical. Something, just in case. I never expected it to become what it did. Years passed. The company grew far beyond anything I had imagined. It became powerful, influential, untouchable in its industry. That small percentage I kept, it grew with it, quietly, consistently. While I was living a completely different life, cooking dinners, attending school meetings, playing the role I believed I had to play. I never touched it,
Never talked about it.
It became something distant, almost unreal.
Until now.
Sitting on the floor of that spare room, surrounded by papers that proved who I really was, I felt something shift inside me again. Not anger this time. Not even sadness. Awareness. They thought I was helpless. They thought I needed to be taken care of. They thought I had no options. The irony was almost laughable. I looked down at the most recent statement in the folder. Numbers I hadn't paid attention to before now stared back at me. Larger than I expected. Larger than most people would see in a lifetime. And suddenly, everything became very clear. I wasn't the one who needed saving. I was the one who had been holding back. For years. For decades. For people who, in the end, didn't even see me. I leaned back against the wall, letting out a slow breath. If they wanted to treat me like I didn't matter, then maybe it was time to remind them exactly who I was. And this time, I wasn't going to hold anything back. The next morning, I woke up feeling different. Not lighter, not happier, but sharper. Focused. Like a part of me that had been asleep for years had suddenly opened its eyes and refused to go back to sleep. I didn't rush out of bed. I didn't check my phone. I simply lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my head, not the pain, not the insult, but the realization. I had options, real ones, and for the first time in a long time, I was actually going to use them. I got up slowly and made myself breakfast. Not the usual quick coffee and toast, but something deliberate. Eggs, fresh fruit, tea. It felt almost ceremonial, like I was marking the beginning of something. Because I was. After eating, I went straight to my desk, opened my laptop, and began making calls. Not hesitant ones. Not uncertain ones. The kind of calls I used to make years ago, clear, direct, and with purpose behind every word. The first call was to a lawyer who had contacted me months earlier about the trust one had ignored for so long. I remembered her name immediately, even though we had only spoken once. When she answered, there was a brief moment of surprise in her voice, but it quickly turned into professionalism. I told her I needed full access to my holdings, detailed information, and immediate availability of funds if necessary. She didn't question me. She didn't hesitate. Within an hour, documents started arriving in my inbox, organized, precise, overwhelming in their scale. I read through them carefully, line by line, reconnecting with a world I had once mastered. What I discovered made one thing very clear. I wasn't just financially secure. I had influence, old privileges, access levels that had been preserved over time simply because no one had thought to remove them. My name still existed in places where it mattered, quietly but powerfully. Then I made my second call. This one felt different.
Familiar.
When the operator answered, I gave my name, not the version people use now, but the one attached to those old records. There was a pause, then a shift in tone. Respect. Recognition. I was transferred almost immediately to a specialized department, and when the representative spoke, I could hear it in his voice. He knew exactly who I was. I booked a flight. Not just any flight. The same one. The exact same one my son and his wife would be on. I knew the time because she had mentioned it so casually during that call, as if it didn't matter. As if I didn't matter. But now it did. Every detail did. First class, the representative confirmed. Of course, I replied calmly. There was no hesitation, no discussion of price. Just confirmation. Seat assignment. Priority boarding. Everything handled within minutes. When I ended the call, I sat there for a second, letting it sink in. This was really happening. Then I smiled. Not out of spite, but because for the first time in a long time, I was no longer reacting. I was acting. The rest of the day moved quickly. I went shopping, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. I chose clothes that felt like me. Not the quiet, invisible version I had become, but the woman I used to be. Clean lines, confident colors, elegance, without apology. When I looked in the mirror that evening, I didn't see someone who needed to be taken care of. I saw someone in control. I didn't tell anyone about my plans. Not my son, not his wife, not even the neighbor, who usually kept an eye on my house. This wasn't something I wanted to explain. This was something I wanted them to see. Friday arrived sooner than expected. The sky was gray, but it didn't matter. I called a car instead of driving myself. Small detail, but intentional. I wasn't going to treat this like just another trip. The airport was busy, loud, chaotic, but I moved through it like I belonged there. Because I did. I bypassed long lines, walked directly to the priority counter, and gave my name. The reaction was subtle, but noticeable. A quick glance at the screen. A slight change in posture. Everything was already prepared. I was offered access to a private lounge, and I accepted. Inside, it was quiet, comfortable, almost detached from the noise outside. I sat near the window with a cup of tea, watching planes move across the runway, remembering a time when this world had been mine. At 1:30, boarding was announced. I didn't rush. There was no need. I walked onto the plane calmly, greeted with respect, guided to my seat, two-way. A perfect view, spacious, quiet, exactly where I was meant to be. I settled in, accepted a glass of champagne, and waited. Passengers began boarding, one by one. Voices, footsteps, movement. I wasn't paying attention at first. I didn't need to, until I heard her voice. Sharp, annoyed. This must be a mistake. I looked up. There she was, standing in the aisle, holding her boarding pass like it was proof of something she deserved. My son stood behind her, already looking uncomfortable. "These seats are ours," she insisted. The flight attendant remained calm, professional. "Checked the system," explained clearly. They were not.
She didn't like that.
Her tone sharpened. Her posture stiffened. The kind of reaction I had seen before, not just in her, but in many people who believed the world should adjust itself to their expectations. I watched quietly. Then my son noticed me. At first, he didn't react. Just stared, like his mind couldn't quite process what he was seeing. Then his expression changed. "Mom," his voice was almost a whisper. She turned, and for a moment, she froze. The confusion on her face was almost immediate. It didn't make sense to her. It couldn't. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Before I could answer, the flight attendant stepped closer to me, her tone shifting slightly, more attentive now. "Is everything all right, Ms. Mary?" That was the moment everything changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. I could see it in her eyes. She understood. Or at least she realized she didn't understand anything at all. I set my glass down gently and looked at them both.
Calm. Composed.
Present.
"Hello," I said.
Simple. But it carried everything. She tried to speak. Tried to ask something. But the words didn't come out right. Her confidence, the one she had on that phone call, was gone, replaced by uncertainty. My son looked between us, trying to piece it together. And for the first time, they weren't in control of the situation anymore. I was. And this was only the beginning. For a few seconds, no one moved. The narrow aisle of the plane suddenly felt too small to hold everything that was happening. I could see it in their faces, confusion, disbelief, and something else beginning to surface, something closer to fear. Not fear of me exactly, but fear of the unknown. Because in that moment, they realized there was a version of me they had never seen before. The flight attendant stood beside me, still composed, waiting for direction. She wasn't looking at them anymore. She was looking at me. That detail did not go unnoticed. "Is everything all right, Ms. Mary?" she asked again, her tone polite but clearly attentive. I gave a small nod. "Everything is fine." Then I turned my eyes back to them. "My son," I added calmly, "and his wife. I believe their seats are further back." It wasn't cruel. It wasn't loud, but it was precise. The kind of statement that leaves no room for argument. Her face changed instantly. Not anger, not yet, but something cracking beneath the surface. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being repositioned, especially not by me. "There's been some mistake," she said, her voice tighter now. "We were supposed to be in first class." The flight attendant checked again, already knowing the answer. "I'm sorry, but your seats are assigned in the economy section. If an upgrade becomes available, we'll let you know." That was the moment she lost control. "I specifically requested first class," she snapped, her voice rising just enough to draw attention. This is unacceptable. I watched her carefully. The same tone, the same entitlement, the same certainty that things would bend for her if she pushed hard enough. But this time, nothing bent. My son touched her arm, trying to calm her down. "Let's just go," he said quietly, clearly uncomfortable now. It's not a big deal, but it was a big deal to her. Because for the first time, she was being told no, and it was happening in front of me. She opened her mouth again, ready to argue. But then another voice interrupted. A senior crew member had approached, her posture confident, her expression respectful, but directed at me. "Ms. Mary," she said warmly, "welcome aboard. We're honored to have you with us today." There it was.
The shift.
Not subtle anymore.
Clear. Public.
Final. Silence followed. I didn't need to look at her to know what was happening inside her head. I could feel it. The calculations. The confusion. The sudden realization that something was very, very different from what she believed. "Honored," she repeated faintly. The crew member smiled politely.
Yes.
It's not every day we have someone with such a significant history connected to the company flying with us. My son blinked. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice uncertain. I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to, because in that moment, the truth wasn't something I had to explain. It was something they were beginning to see. "Sir," the flight attendant said gently, "we do need to continue boarding. If you could please take your assigned seats." This time, there was no argument, no resistance. She stepped back slowly, almost mechanically, like her body was moving before her mind could catch up. My son followed her, but not before looking back at me one more time. That look stayed with me. Not anger, not disappointment. Something deeper. Confusion mixed with regret. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of understanding. I sat back down, picked up my glass, and took a small sip. The champagne tasted exactly the same as before, but everything else had changed. As the plane began to fill and the noise settled into a low hum, I allowed myself to breathe. Not a sigh of relief, but something closer to alignment. For years, I had made myself smaller to keep peace. Now, I was simply taking up the space that had always been mine. The plane eventually began to move, taxiing toward the runway. The safety announcements played, passengers settled in, and the world outside the window blurred into motion. Takeoff was smooth, quiet, almost symbolic, because as the ground disappeared beneath us, I realized something important. So had everything I used to accept. About 20 minutes into the flight, after the seatbelt sign turned off, I noticed movement in the aisle. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. "Mom," he said softly. I turned my head. He looked different. Not physically, but in the way he held himself. Less certain. Less protected. "Can we talk?" he asked. The seat next to me was empty. I gestured toward it.
Seat.
He did, slowly, like he wasn't entirely sure he was allowed to be there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he exhaled. "I don't understand what's going on," he said. She's really upset back there. She keeps saying she made a mistake." I looked at him carefully. "Did she?" I asked. He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "When she suggested I should go live somewhere else," I said calmly. "Did that sound like a mistake to you at the time?" He didn't answer immediately. That told me enough. "I didn't think she meant it like that," he said eventually, but even he didn't sound convinced. I leaned back slightly. "Let me ask you something," I continued. "Before today, who did you think I was?" He blinked, caught off guard. "You're my mom," he said. "Just your mom?" He hesitated. "Well, yeah." That word landed heavier than he realized.
Just.
Just a mother. Just someone who had always been there. Just someone who could always be adjusted. I nodded slowly. That's the problem, I said. He looked at me, confused. You never asked who I was before you needed me, I explained. Before I became everything for you. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable now. Mom, I didn't know there was more to know. Exactly. Silence stretched between us. Then he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. So, what is this? He asked. Why are they treating you like that? What did they mean by history with the company? I studied his face for a moment. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was realization trying to form, and I had a choice. I could tell him everything, or I could let him sit with not knowing. I chose something in between. I was part of something, I said simply. A long time ago. Something that became much bigger than anyone expected. He stared at me. You're serious? Yes. And you never told me? I held his gaze. You never asked. That silence again. But this one felt different. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair, processing everything all at once. Behind us, somewhere in the cabin, I could hear faint movement. Her voice, quieter now, no longer sharp, no longer confident. Something had shifted for her too, but this wasn't about her anymore. This was about him. Mom, he said slowly, did I mess this up? I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, this wasn't something that broke in one moment. It was something that had been building for years. You didn't protect me, I said finally. Not harsh. Just honest. He looked down, and for the first time since this all began, he didn't try to defend himself. The rest of the flight felt longer, but not uncomfortable, just different, because everything that had been hidden was no longer invisible, and everything that had been assumed was now being questioned. As the plane continued toward our destination, I realized something with absolute clarity. This wasn't just a trip. This was a turning point.
For them.
But more importantly,
For me.
by the time we landed, the tension between us had settled into something heavy and unavoidable. It wasn't explosive anymore. It was quieter than that, more dangerous. The kind of silence that forces people to think, to replay every word, every moment, every choice that led them here. As we walked through the airport, I didn't rush. I didn't wait for them either. I simply moved at my own pace, aware of their presence behind me, but not turning around. For the first time in years, I wasn't adjusting myself to fit into their world. They were the ones trying to catch up to mine. Outside, the warm air hit my face, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to enjoy it. The ocean was somewhere nearby. I could feel it even if I couldn't see it yet. That sense of openness, of space, felt symbolic. Like I had stepped into a version of life that had been waiting for me all along. A driver was already waiting. He greeted me by name. Not ma'am. Not passenger.
Mary.
That detail didn't go unnoticed either. I got into the car without hesitation. Before the door closed, I glanced back just once. They were standing there, side by side, both looking uncertain, like they weren't sure whether to approach me or stay where they were. I didn't invite them, and I didn't stop them. The door closed. The car moved, and just like that, I left them standing there. The hotel was exactly what I expected, quiet, elegant, designed for people who valued privacy more than attention. When I entered the suite, I paused for a moment near the window. The view was breathtaking. Endless ocean, sunlight reflecting off the water, a horizon that seemed to stretch forever. I should have felt triumphant, but I didn't. What I felt was clarity, because none of this was about proving anything. It was about finally seeing things the way they really were. I hadn't been pushed out of their lives in one moment. It had happened slowly, quietly over years. Small decisions, small silences, small compromises that added up to something much bigger.
And now,
We were here. That afternoon, my phone rang. I knew who it was before I even looked. I let it ring once.
twice.
Then I answered. Mom. His voice came through quickly, almost too quickly, like he was afraid I wouldn't pick up. Can we talk? I looked out at the ocean again. We will, I said calmly. But not like this. There was a pause. Then when, he asked. Tomorrow, I replied.
Here.
Another pause. Okay, he said quietly.
No arguments.
No pressure. That alone told me everything had already begun to change. The next day, they arrived exactly on time. I opened the door myself. For a moment, none of us spoke. She looked different. Not in appearance, but in energy. The sharpness was gone, replaced by something more fragile. My son looked the same way, like someone who had been forced to rethink everything he thought he understood. I stepped aside.
Come in.
They did. We sat in the living area. Me in a chair, them on the sofa across from me. The distance between us wasn't just physical. It was everything that had happened, everything that had been said, and everything that hadn't. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Eventually, she spoke first. I owe you an apology. Her voice was quiet, careful, measured. I watched her for a moment before responding. For what? I asked. She blinked, caught slightly off guard.
For what I said. For how I handled things.
That's not specific, I replied calmly. My son shifted slightly beside her, clearly uncomfortable. She swallowed. For suggesting you should move somewhere else. I tilted my head slightly. Why did you suggest that? Another pause. I thought it would be better for everyone. No, I said gently but firmly. That's not the reason. She looked down. My son glanced at her, then back at me. Tell the truth, I added. The room felt heavier instantly, because now we weren't talking about words anymore. We were talking about intentions. She took a breath, then another. I wanted you out of the way, she said finally. The honesty landed hard, but it didn't surprise me. I had already known. I felt like you were always there, she continued, her voice shaking slightly now. Like no matter what I did, I was being compared to you. To everything you've done, everything he says about you. I felt like I could never measure up. I listened without interrupting. This wasn't about defending myself. This was about understanding the truth. So your solution, I said quietly, was to remove me. She nodded. I didn't think of it like that at the time, she admitted. But yes. My son looked at her like he was hearing this for the first time. You never told me that, he said.
She didn't respond.
Because there was nothing left to hide. I turned my attention to him. And you?
I asked.
What was your reason? He didn't hesitate as long. I didn't want conflict, he said. I thought if I just stayed neutral, it would pass. I held his gaze. It didn't pass, I said. I know. And while you were staying neutral, I continued, I was the one being removed. His shoulders dropped slightly. I see that now. That mattered. Not because it fixed anything, but because it meant he was finally looking at it clearly. Silence filled the room again. But this time it wasn't empty. It was full of truth. Uncomfortable. Necessary. Real. What happens now? He asked quietly. That was the question. The one that actually mattered. I stood up slowly and walked toward the window, looking out at the ocean again. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to be sure I said it exactly the way I meant it. When I turned back, they were both watching me, waiting. This doesn't go back to how it was, I said.
No hesitation. No softness.
Just truth. I saw it in their faces, the understanding that this wasn't something that could be undone with apologies or promises. You don't get to decide where I belong anymore, I continued. And You don't get to make decisions about my life based on your convenience. She nodded slowly. I understand. Do you? I asked. She met my eyes. Yes. I looked at my son. And you? I do, he said. Another pause. Then I sat back down. If there's going to be a relationship moving forward, I said, it will be different. How? He asked. Equal, I replied. That word stayed in the air longer than anything else we had said, because that was the part none of us had ever truly experienced before. Not like this. Not honestly. And if we can't do that, he asked quietly. I held his gaze. Then we don't pretend. We didn't argue after that. We didn't raise our voices, because everything that needed to be said had been said. They left not long after. And when the door closed behind them, I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence again. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt earned. That evening, as the sun began to set, I stepped out onto the balcony and watched the horizon shift colors. The air was calm, the sound of the ocean steady, constant, unlike everything else that had changed. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something. Or someone. I wasn't trying to fix anything.
Or prove anything.
I was simply
there.
And that was enough. Because whatever happened next would happen on my terms. 6 months later, I stood barefoot on the terrace of my new home, watching the ocean stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The air was cooler here, calmer, touched by a quiet kind of freedom I hadn't known I was missing. The house itself wasn't extravagant, but it didn't need to be. It was intentional. Every room, every detail, chosen not out of obligation or habit, but because I wanted it that way. That was the difference. For the first time in decades, nothing in my life existed because someone else needed it to, only because I did. The decision to move hadn't been impulsive, even if it seemed that way to others. It came from something much deeper than anger or pride. It came from clarity. During those final days of that trip, after the conversations, after the silence that followed them, I realized something simple and undeniable. I could not go back to the life I had before. Not because it was terrible, but because it was no longer honest. I had spent years shrinking myself into a role that was easier for everyone else to understand. Mother, support,
background.
And somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that I had once been something more. Not better. Just more. So, I chose something different. I sold the house, packed only what mattered, left the rest behind without regret. That surprised me the most, not the decision itself, but how little it hurt to let go of things I once thought defined my life. Furniture, objects, even certain memories, they lost their weight the moment I stopped attaching my identity to them. What I kept was simple. Photographs, a few personal items, and the documents that reminded me who I had been and still was. The rest? I didn't need it anymore. The transition wasn't difficult. Not practically. When you have resources, things move faster, smoother, quieter. But this wasn't about money. It never really was. It was about permission. The permission I had finally given myself to live differently. The first few weeks in the new house were quiet, not lonely. That's an important difference. Quiet in a way that allowed space for thought, for reflection, for rediscovering things I had pushed aside for years. I started walking every morning, just along the coastline, no destination, no urgency. I found myself noticing details again, the sound of waves, the smell of salt in the air, the rhythm of something that existed completely outside of human expectations. And slowly, I began to feel like myself again. My days filled naturally, without force. I became involved in a local community group helping women who, like me, had spent most of their lives building something for others, and were now trying to figure out what came next. Some were starting small businesses. Some were learning new skills. Some were simply trying to remember what they enjoyed. I understood all of them, because I had been all of them. It didn't take long before I was helping organize things, offering advice, sharing experiences. Not as someone superior, but as someone who had lived through the same questions they were asking now. And for the first time in years, I felt useful in a way that didn't require me to disappear. My son started calling more often. At first, it felt careful, like he was testing the space between us, unsure how close he was allowed to get. Our conversations weren't long, but they were different, more honest, less automatic. He asked questions now, not just about how I was, but about who I was. That mattered. One evening, he called while I was sitting outside, watching the sunset. "Mom," he said, "how's everything there?" I smiled slightly. "Peaceful," I replied. There was a pause. "I'm glad," he said, and I believed him. That was new too. He mentioned visiting. Not immediately. Not insistently. Just as a possibility. I didn't say yes right away. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because this time I wasn't going to agree to things out of habit. "I'd like that," I said eventually. "When the time feels right." He understood. I could hear it in his silence. As for her, things were different there too. Not close, not warm, but honest. She had reached out once, carefully, choosing her words more thoughtfully than I had ever seen before. There were no excuses this time. No softened versions of what happened. Just acknowledgement. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't need to. Forgiveness isn't something you give on demand. But I didn't close the door either. Because this wasn't about holding on to anger. It was about maintaining clarity. One afternoon, while going through some papers, I received an invitation. A formal one. From the company I had once helped build. They were holding a board meeting. A significant one. And they wanted me there. For a long moment, I just stared at the letter. That part of my life had always felt like something finished.
Closed.
Left behind.
But now,
It didn't feel like the past anymore. It felt like an option.
a choice.
And that changed everything. I didn't answer right away. I placed the letter on the table and stepped outside, letting the ocean air clear my thoughts. The question wasn't whether I could return to that world. I knew I could. The question was whether I wanted to. And for the first time in my life, that decision belonged only to me. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in deep shades of gold and orange, I caught my reflection in the glass door behind me. I paused for a moment, studying it not critically, not nostalgically, just honestly. I looked older.
Of course I did.
But I also looked stronger, clearer, like someone who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. And maybe that was the most important change of all. Later that evening, my phone rang again. This time it was my granddaughter. "Grandma," she said excitedly, "Dad told me you live near the ocean now. Is it really that beautiful?" I smiled. "It is," I said. "Even more than you can imagine." "Can I come visit someday?" she asked. I looked out at the darkening horizon, the sound of waves steady and constant. "Yes," I said softly. "You can." Because that was the future I wanted. Not one built on obligation or expectation, but one built on choice. That night, as I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I realized something simple. Nothing dramatic had happened. No grand revenge. No final victory. Just a series of decisions. Honest ones. And somehow, that was enough. Because in the end, this was never about proving them wrong. It was about finally choosing myself. And this time, I wasn't going to forget who I was. Ever again.